Welcome back to the shop, everybody. We're going to forge something groovy today, something sharp, and a little bit of Christmas lights on there because it is December, and who doesn't love some Christmas lights? So we'll get the forge lit here and start with a nice chunk of 5200 steel, 3/4 round bar. We just need to flatten that down a little bit before we get into forging the razor here. Working with round stock typically means you need to flatten it out unless you're doing some kind of integral build. But I think I've mentioned before the reason I have this round stock is because it's a lot more cost effective in that volume or for that amount of steel. And so I also have other dimensions and sizes of stock too, but this can be a cost effective option. So we've got it flattened down there, and we're going to use this block here to isolate a tang off the main bit of stock here. Using the 50-pound Little Giant makes this a lot quicker and easier, of course. Forge that tang down. This will be the first straight razor that I've ever completed, and I have forged a couple before that were not that great. Didn't actually end up finishing them. One of them would have probably worked, but this one we're going to finish all the way. So doing some hand hammering here and keeping this 5200 steel at a good forging heat. Stiffens up pretty fast on you if you let it get too cool. It is not so finicky when it comes to forging as far as cracking it as something like 01, but it becomes more difficult to forge. So you can see right there, I'm going to stop and put it right back in forge. A lot of people have mentioned how my anvil is not secured down, and that's true. It's not. There's a reason for that, and that is primarily that I have a small shop and I tend to move things around here and there depending on what I'm doing. And one of these years when I'm in my permanent shop, I'm sure I will probably secure that down. But everybody is concerned about it. But the crucial thing is the fact that that anvil is spiked down to that big stump. And so the mass that you have available to you with that combination is more than adequate. And while really the only thing that would be better is if you sunk a stump, a couple of feet into the ground and did it that way. So I use my press there a little bit to try to get the steel right at a 1/4 inch because I had a 1/4 inch kiss blocks on there, or spacers, and I was just right there anyway, so it didn't do a lot, but oh well. So I had a little cold shut I had to deal with, and that needs to be ground out or addressed as soon as you see it, really. If I continue forging at this point, it's going to create a crack essentially right at the junction of the tang and the blade, and that's obviously no good. So got that ground out. Got a little extra material on the tang here. I don't really need that much, but I'm trying to figure out what sort of shape I want the tang here, since that is what you hold on to when you're using the razor. And there's a few different styles out there, so I had to think about it for a minute. But at this point, we've got the bevel forged in like you saw. And the thing about razors, they're hollow ground. At least all the ones I've seen are, which lends itself to a very thin edge, which is useful in this application. But the other thing is that the thickness or width of the spine is important for the function and maintenance of the razor. And there's a direct correlation between the thickness of the spine and the width of the razor itself. And typically, to my understanding, that is a 1-to-4 ratio. So, for example, in this case, I started out trying to make a razor with a spine that's a 1/4 inch thick, which means the width needs to be 1 inch. And I got a little bit thinner on the spine, so I made the razor a little bit narrower, a little closer to 7/8 or somewhere in that neighborhood. The reason for this is when you go to hone your razor, you're laying that edge of that spine down flat on the stone along with the edge, and that provides the correct angle. To my understanding, that provides the correct angle to hone that razor, which is obviously a very, very shallow angle, so you get a very thin, sharp edge. And in this particular application, that's what you want. So as I understand it, as you use the razor over a period of time, the edge and the spine thickness are going to wear down simultaneously and maintain that ratio. At least that's how I understand it. I'm not an expert on razors by any stretch. Just learned a couple of things a while ago that need to happen when you're forging a razor. And it's just interesting that, anytime you try a new blade project, there's a lot of different subtleties that are not necessarily readily apparent. And so you learn stuff, and then you learn things along the way by not necessarily doing them correctly the first time. But we've got the blade normalized and heat cycled a couple of times, and I'm going to go ahead and rough grind it. I don't want to grind a bunch of hardened steel, and I also want to make sure the edge is nice and thin for superb hardening when we go into the quench here. AAA quench oil for this 50-100 steel, and we can go ahead and temper the blade, and then we can finish grind it. Now, this is true of any blade following heat treating, but it's especially true of thin blades like this one, and that is being very careful to make sure the blade does not overheat when you're finished grinding it, because if it does, it'll ruin it. And once you get down to a blade this thin, that can happen in less than a second. So what I'm doing here is I'm bringing this hollow grind up to a tighter radius up right by the spine, as you can see there. So with that, the intention here is to create a high hollow grind and a very thin blade down towards the edge. So the thinner the radius up into that hollow grind there, you have potential for a thinner edge sooner, if that makes sense. So I was working on blending that in, and did that with marginal success, in my opinion. You can see some of the different facets there. But then I went ahead and roughed in an edge by hand, and the reason for that is to reveal along that bright line there, as you saw, the different thicknesses that are still present, because the grind is not completely even. So which is kind of difficult to do, but then you're able to come back and touch that up once you've revealed that with the initial edge that you put in there. So once I'm satisfied with the blade grind here, I can go ahead and hand sand it, and I'm going to go up to an 800 grit hand sanded finish on the blade, but on the spine and the end of the blade, I'm going to go ahead and polish this out after going to 400 grit. I also touched the blade up a little bit on the buffer, but again, this is where you have to be very careful, and this is why I did not really buff the blade out to a polish, because it would be extremely easy to overheat that blade on the buffing wheel and ruin the hardness. And so I just did the spine and the end and went over the blade a little bit, and then came back with 800 grit for a satin finish. So now we can go ahead and put in the logo, and I use an adhesive stencil that I make, and some salt water and electricity for a quick little electrolysis process here to remove that steel per the stencil. Works pretty good. So now I've got a piece of hardwood here, and I need to build the guard. I'm not sure what you call this part of the razor, to be honest, but the folding handle part that the blade sits into. And I'm going to rough that out, leave myself some extra material, kind of work it into where it needs to be. It looks a little goofy right now. I need to refine that shape a bit, but went ahead and sliced those two pieces in half, and we've got two scales here, and they're still pretty thick. But the first thing to do is to line up the rivet hole that's going to allow the razor to pivot in this assembly. And I've got some 3/32 inch thick German silver or nickel silver pin stock here. And of course that's actually a combination of copper and nickel, not silver at all, but it makes for a nice pin material. Per usual, I'm using a 36 grit aluminum oxide belt on the KMG grinder here to rough in the handle shape. And now we need to make a spacer that will act as the portion to which the blade actually rests against inside this inside the scales here. And I've got a piece of black paper micarta, so it's layers of paper in a phenolic resin, and we'll get that shaped up here on the inside dimensions, and we can epoxy this whole thing together. So using the razor itself to make sure that I have this spacer indexed correctly, so I can open the razor and it will fit down in there like it needs to. So one little thing I ran into here is that the spacer is 1/8 of an inch thick and the tang on this razor is closer to 1/4 inch, and so I could have ground the tang down, but I wanted to leave that forged finish on there. So instead I had to go ahead and relieve some of that material in that slot there so that the razor could actually fit in there and then rotate all the way around. But I was able to do that, and we'll go ahead and shape this up the rest of the way, hand sand it, and then apply some Watco Danish oil with a walnut stained color. Alright, we can go ahead and assemble this thing here, getting close to being finished. Of course, in the future I'd pay attention to that tang thickness and make that a little bit more uniform for an overall better setup, but it's going together okay. And now we need to peen this pin over very carefully, and I left myself just enough material so we don't have to spread that out any more than necessary. Don't want to crack that wood. So the next part, the fun part, testing the razor, and I really didn't do a proper whisker prep on this, and so I'm not going to say that it went as well as it could have, but the idea was to test whether or not this razor can actually shave, and it did. And it could have been stropped a little bit finer. Probably have some work to do on that technique, but it did shave, and I think overall it was a successful project. Alright guys, well thanks for coming along on this project. Obviously my straight razor skills leave a little bit to be desired, as you can probably see, but as far as the project goes, we did in fact forge and complete a razor that actually shaves. Learned a number of things on this project, so as always it was a good time. What I'm going to do with this razor is give it away when we reach 100,000 subscribers, which isn't too far off. So if you want to get a chance to win this, the one and only currently existing Fire Creek Forge straight razor in existence, just leave a comment on this video below here, and when we reach 100,000 subscribers, I will use a third-party winner chooser thingamajigger and randomly pick somebody to take this home. So as always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next video.